I want to say welcome to everyone. Also want to let you know right off the bat that we have automated closed captioning available for the webinar. You can click live transcript for options. And just want to welcome everyone to the Texas Children in Nature Network's virtual webinar, Birding a Multiplier for Liberation and Justice. My name is Alice Jansen, and I'm the Education Events Coordinator with the Texas Children in Nature Network. And we are super excited to have you with us today. We are recording this session, so thanks for joining us. And to save bandwidth and for video quality purposes, we ask everyone to please turn off their cameras and mute themselves during the presentation. I will be monitoring the chat, so you can share your questions there, and I will share them with Corina during the Q&A part of our presentation today. We have Ashley Chabeli-Pettis and Melody Alcazar. They're running our tech for us today, so thank you, ladies. We are recording today's session, and I will share the recording link in a follow-up email next week. If you are uncomfortable with your name showing, you can change your name to anonymous and then private message Ashley or Melody with your name for our attendance. Also, if your Zoom name does not match the name you registered with, please change your name or private message Ashley or Melody with your name from registration. And this part is very important. If you need a certificate of completion for this webinar, we do need the name you registered with to issue the certificate. Also, only registrants that are participating in the live webinar are eligible to receive a certificate of completion. I'm going to go ahead and read our land acknowledgement. The Texas Children in Nature Network is headquartered in Austin, and as such, I am on the ancestral and unceded land of the Tonkawa, Comanche, and Sana people. Our ongoing colonial presence on indigenous lands compels us to take action now to counter-effect the effects of colonization. The work we do through the Texas Children in Nature Network is one small step towards that effort. I'm going to put some information in the chat to learn more about land acknowledgements and these indigenous peoples groups. I would like to welcome our speaker today, Corina Newsome with the National Wildlife Federation. Thanks so much for being here, Corina, and go ahead and take it away. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Alice, and thank you so much to the Texas Children in Nature Network for inviting me to participate today. I personally am extremely passionate about connecting children in particular with the world around them through nature, through wildlife in particular, and through birds, which I will be talking about today during this presentation. And so if you have questions or thoughts that you'd like to share, again, we encourage you to put it in the chat. And at the end of the presentation, I will answer those questions. As Alice mentioned, she'll be able to read those questions aloud after I have made it through. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and get started. Great. All right, so birding as an activity and birds as just a group of wildlife have really changed my life in some incredible ways. And so I'm excited to share with you how that's happened and how powerful they are as a mechanism for connecting people with the world around them. But I always do like to start from the beginning. And just to give you some background on my current position, I work with National Wildlife Federation as a conservation scientist. My office is based out of DC, but I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and work pretty heavily in the southeastern United States in policy, conservation science, and education as well. So again, very excited to be here. So starting from the time I was very young, I believe this particular note was from the age of 5, I had a lot of vocational clarity, as a lot of kids seem to do, right? If you survey, and I think there have been surveys done to kind of demonstrate that kids, when they're kids, have, passions across, cultural groups and age groups. And it's not until they grow up that things start to change. But when I was younger, this is a note that I wrote to myself. I said, this is what I want to do when I grow up. I want to be an astronaut, which you can disregard because I cannot even get on a roller coaster. But I want to be an astronaut and a scientist. And I want to be a scientist on bugs and animals. And so I knew from a very young age that I really loved animals and I wanted to be able to work alongside them. But I grew up in a really urban environment. I'm originally born and raised from Philadelphia, go Eagles. And so where I lived didn't have, these are some snapshots from my neighborhood and from my commute that I would have to and from school every day, through all the way through high school. So I lived in a pretty heavily urbanized environment, a very historical environment. So Philadelphia has a lot of history, everything from the Underground Railroad to, a lot of colonial history as well. And so this environment was not one that fostered a lot of connection with the natural world. I didn't know any environmental educators. There was no environmental science featured in any of my classes in school or outside of school. And so I didn't really have in my everyday life opportunities to connect. So my mom, seeing that I was very passionate about wildlife, she bought me all kinds of books like the Wildlife Fact Files. I don't know if there are any, people who go way back with wildlife, but the fact files are life-changing. I had hundreds and hundreds of National Geographic books that my grandmother had collected and had graciously passed down to me, and I was a faithful reader and loved finding the issues that focused a lot on wildlife. And then, of course, I relied very heavily on what I was able to find in the media. So on TV, the documentaries on PBS, like PBS Nature. And we were also, I think the world was pretty lucky to have some really incredible science communicators. And some of my favorites growing up, the ones who I saw on TV, included people like Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter from Australia, the Kratt brothers, Mbumufu, the sheephawk lemur, right? Still in love with Mbumufu. And then everyone's favorite fashion icon and science communicator, Bill Nye the Science Guy. So these were my favorite shows growing up. And these people are truly skilled at what they do. They probably connected millions and millions and millions of kids to science and the world around them in some really effective ways. The only problem with that is that over the years, after writing that note to myself and then, being exposed to some really great science communication, but limited science communication, was that there was no reflection of myself in those science communicators. So as excellent as Bill Nye the Science Guy and the Crocodile Hunter are, and as much as I enjoyed watching them, what that ended up doing was telling myself subconsciously that things like wildlife explorers and scientists, those careers that I was seeing portrayed on TV, were not things that Black people did, were not things that Black women did. Pretty much all of the science communicators I ever saw on TV were white men. And I didn't even realize that that was changing how I thought about myself until I was about to graduate high school. And a man at my church, Mr. Mark Garrett, who I randomly will thank him for this to this day, he kind of heard through the grapevine that I liked animals. And he came up to me one day after church and he said, hey, my sister works at the zoo, so the Philadelphia Zoo. I'll give her your number and have her call you. I was 16 or 17. And I remember my immediate reaction, Mr. Mark is Black. So his sister in my mind, of course, would be Black. And I was like, well, if she's Black, she doesn't work with wildlife, so she can't help me. I like animals. How can she help me? I had immediately made all these assumptions about who she was and what she did. And it turned out his sister's name was Michelle, and she was actually the lead carnivore keeper at the Philadelphia Zoo. The Philadelphia Zoo is the first zoo in the country, a leading zoo, and she was breeding endangered carnivores from all over the world and leading those efforts. The moment I got the chance to connect with her and meet her, the entire trajectory of my life and career and how I even understood what was possible for me changed basically in an instant. And she was gracious enough to take me under her wing. And over the course of that next summer, I think I was 17 to 18 years old at this time, she got me an internship at the Philadelphia Zoo. I had never even been to the zoo before. I was 17 years old, had never been in the zoo, mainly because it was too expensive to go. And I was put in the education department. And that's where my love for educating was actually birthed. I was terrified of talking to people. I didn't know what I was doing when I first got there. And then I ended up loving it. I was able to connect people who visited the zoo, who ranged in ages and cultures, with the wildlife that they were seeing at the zoo and their conservation plight. And that was the birth of my love for wildlife conservation and my knowledge about wildlife conservation and connecting people with wildlife. And so after I was exposed to those possibilities because of one Black woman who I happened to meet through someone at my church, all of the possibilities for my life changed, and the direction of my life changed entirely for the better. And so I went on to major in zoo and wildlife biology in undergrad and got my bachelor's degree in zoo and wildlife biology, where I was able to get more experience in animal care, as well as start a whole education program myself using the animals that were in my care at my college and connect folks with wildlife, starting essentially from the beginning of my kind of professional education. And so, as I mentioned, from the time I was very little, I knew I loved animals kind of broadly as a very broad category of fields. But when I was in college, there was a class called ornithology, which was a required course. And I remember when I came in as a freshman, I'd heard about this class. You had to memorize hundreds of birds by sight, native birds, and dozens and dozens and dozens by sound. And as much as I loved animals, because the zoo was kind of my first entrance into conservation, I wasn't really familiar with any native wildlife. And when it came to birds, I certainly didn't think that there were even hundreds of birds to know about in North America. So I was terrified. I'm like, I've never even noticed birds, right? I've never seen birds really. How this will drop my GPA. I was certain of it. Turned out, that class was actually the beginning of my passion for birds. It happened on the first day of the lab portion of the class, and the professor was going through some of the 10 most common birds in the Northeast US, which is where I lived. And the bird that he put on the screen, the first bird was this bird, a blue jay. And I remember when I was in my class, I like exclaimed, I was like, what is that bird? And I had heard of the name blue jay before, but I pictured something not this, right? I didn't think that a bird that looked like this could live anywhere near where I lived. And so everyone was looking at me like, you've never seen a blue jay. And sure enough, when that class was over and I went outside, I was going to school in Ohio, blue jays were everywhere. They were pouring off the trees, loud, bright, big birds, right? I'm someone who loves wildlife, has loved wildlife my whole life, and was getting a degree in wildlife science. And I was at this point like 21 and did not notice birds. It was like a light bulb clicked on in my head. If I, someone who was already looking out for wildlife, already thinking about nature, right, and the world around me, was able to miss birds, and nonetheless some of the largest, brightest, loudest birds out there, how much is everyone else missing? People who maybe are not getting a degree in wildlife science, or who are not necessarily drawn to animals per se. And I realized in that moment that there's so much that I didn't know. Birds kind of became this treasure hunt for me, which is the case to this day. And I also realized, because this was not only the beginning of my love for the study of birds, it was the beginning of my love for birding, going outside and looking at and watching birds. I realized how powerful it was of a tool, how powerful of a vehicle they were for connecting myself and others with the world around us. And so birds inherently are incredibly cool. And then they're a great way to help people just pay attention to the life outside. And I was sold after that and have been chasing birds ever since. And so after I graduated college, I went on to be a zookeeper for about 4 years, and I worked as an ambassador animal keeper. So I was working with animals that were also kind of part of our education programs at the zoo. This here is a picture of a Palawan binturong, for example, but the majority of the animals that I was working with were thankfully birds, because birds are my passion. And so on the top left-hand side there, that is a turkey vulture doing some free flight programs outside. You got a silvery-cheeked hornbill on the right-hand side there. A green-winged macaw on the bottom, and a Moluccan cockatoo. And then in the center, a hooded vulture, which is a vulture from the continent of Africa. And birds continued, from, kind of first getting introduced to birds from a distance, so to speak, from birding and through the binoculars, to being able to work really hands-on with birds in an animal care capacity, really gave me such a well-rounded and powerful connection to birds that really, to this day, informs my ability to use them as a way to connect others to the world around them. My job as a keeper, sorry, trigger warning, spider, also involved not just, animal care, I should say, involved, what you think of when you think of taking care of animals, but it also involves their, tracking their health and monitoring their health. So I was able to participate in, routine procedures like weighing our tarantulas to make sure that they were at a healthy weight for a spider, all the way up to medical procedures for our animals. And on the left-hand side, that is a crow, an American crow, which is a native species. He suffered an injury in the wild that prevented him from being released. And he's receiving acupuncture here, actually. Birds get acupuncture sometimes to treat some of their, some pain if they have some. In addition to that, raising babies was sometimes part of my work. These are not birds. They were typically mammals who ended up needing some care from the keepers early on in life. And then one of my favorite parts, and I would say maybe my very favorite part of the job, was educating the public with primarily birds. And so I had the opportunity to work with everything from small classrooms to kind of audiences at the zoo during the summertime, connecting them to the world around them immediately and around the globe through the birds and other wildlife that they could find where they lived or see when they came to visit the zoo. And so after, going through my college career, my undergrad career, and then spending about 4 years in animal care, and I actually knew this from the time that I took that first ornithology class. I knew that whatever I did in my life, I wanted to be able to contribute to the conservation of birds and connecting people with birds. And so after a few years of working as an animal care professional, I wanted to start answering questions myself about how we can help birds survive in a changing world. And so I decided that it was time to go back to school, to plunge back into academia for a little while and do a master's degree in biology. I went to Georgia Southern University in Statesboro, Georgia, where I studied avian conservation, but specifically focusing on coastal birds, and specifically focusing on the seaside sparrow. Now, the interesting thing was, throughout the course of my career, every time I've taken on a new task or a new adventure, it is pretty much the first time I'm learning about any of the information that's involved. Because I'm from, Philadelphia, I'm from a really urban kind of neighborhood and environment. Because I didn't really have access to educators or access to people who worked in these fields professionally, I didn't really ever know what I was getting myself into. So I kind of took each step as it presented itself. When I got the opportunity to go to graduate school in Georgia, prior to that, I didn't even know Georgia had a coast. Okay, that's how far removed I was from kind of knowing, about the natural landscapes across the US and especially the wildlife. And so when I got the opportunity to come to Georgia, I was presented with some research opportunities to study the seaside sparrow, which is a little bird that, unless you know to look for it, you might not even know was there. They blend in very well, and they are incredibly adapted to life in a coastal environment. They're very small, but they live in a pretty harsh environment. Salt marshes is where they're found. And if you look at a salt marsh, if you've ever been on the coast, it looks kind of like a homogeneous bed or expanse of grass that doesn't have much going on, but that could not be further from the truth. These birds are navigating a series of, I don't want to call them necessarily threats, but sometimes threats, but at the very least challenges to their survival. They build their nests in a tidal environment, which means the water rises and falls twice a day, especially here in Georgia. And they're also navigating challenges like predators, right? So it turns out that they build their nests elevated off the ground, suspended in the grass. If they build it at a certain height that makes them kind of vulnerable to flooding, right? The high tide might come up, flood the nest, and that nest might fail. The offspring might die. If that happens, they'll build another nest right away, but they'll build it a little higher so they won't get flooded again. The challenge is that the higher they build a nest, the more likely it is the predator will find it. So they're kind of navigating these balancing these opposing threats as they're doing something as important as breeding and producing offspring. And so in the face of climate change, which is threatening a whole everyone and everything in some way, shape, or form, but especially coastal communities of people and wildlife, I wanted to understand how can we better predict or anticipate what's going to happen as they're navigating these threats that are getting closer and closer and closer together as sea level rise and flooding intensifies. I won't go too deep into that at all, but I had, again, the opportunity for the first time in my life. I had never even seen a salt marsh in my life before I did this research. I was able to really immerse myself in this ecosystem. This is me in the salt marsh struggling to walk through the grass. And in addition to the species that I was studying, I was also just through my travels able to see all kinds of birds like wood storks and roseate spoonbills and egrets and herons. I was able to see all kinds of invertebrates like so many species of crabs that I never even imagined, millions of fiddler crabs running throughout the marsh, sharks in the water, dolphins in the water. And I got to be able to peel the curtains back, so to speak, on the world of birds that live in this very vulnerable, very dynamic environment. And it really changed my life. So once again, from learning about birds and ornithology to taking care of birds as a keeper to now being able to observe and study birds in their natural environment, my world just continued to expand at unbelievable rates. Every day I was amazed by something. Something made me smile and beam every single day that I was out there in the salt marsh. And I was able to use a lot of equipment that, looked behind the scenes, peeled the curtain back. I got to see small birds. I'm going to put this on mute so you can't hear me squealing in delight looking at this baby bird. But I was able to look up close at the development of small birds and get a bird's eye view, so to speak, at some of the threats and dynamics that they're navigating. And this is just a cool video. So this is a video from a nest camera that I had of nest predation, actually. And so in just a couple of moments, there you go. You'll see your predator, one of many that lives in the salt marsh. This is an American mink. And so I was able to just kind of get an up close view of what these birds were experiencing and answer questions that help us manage them in a changing world. And as I was learning more about the threats of birds, I was realizing, and of course, on a surface level, I understood that we all share the same planet. So things that hurt wildlife probably hurt people too in some way, but I never saw it, felt it, right? And it hit me. Actually, like a light bulb went off in my head. One day I was out in the salt marsh, and in coastal Georgia, there is actually a lot of pollution, paper mills, lots of industrial kind of factories that are polluting the air and the water. And there was actually one right next to the marsh where I worked. And one day the wind was blowing in such a way that the emissions from this factory or whatever it was were blowing in my direction. And I could barely breathe, like it burned my chest. And in that moment, I was like, all these things are happening at the same time. And truly the environmental threats that are facing wildlife and threatening the resources that they need to survive, especially in a changing world, are also disproportionately harming Black people, Indigenous peoples across the continent, communities of color, people with disabilities, people in the LGBTQIA plus community, right? In ways that I didn't even think about, right? And I'm not going to go deep into how these dynamics play out, but it's true. And those vulnerabilities are really felt by people in these communities, including my own communities. And because of that, I knew that I needed to do something to contribute to intersectional problem solving that did not look at wildlife in a silo or look at a particular wildlife threat in a silo, but instead understood that wildlife conservation is part of a bigger picture of justice and equity for all people, and especially those who've experienced the brunt of environmental problems and are poised to experience the brunt of environmental problems going into the future. And so I now work at National Wildlife Federation, as I mentioned before, as a conservation scientist, and my work is rooted in integrating equity and environmental justice into conservation science, practice, and policy. So that means the way that we are doing science, the way that we collect our data, the way that we are engaging people in the process of the scientific method as we are doing these projects and creating these studies and publishing our work. Practice, meaning, okay, once we've learned about the systems that we're working in, how do we make decisions about managing wildlife and managing our natural resources? And then what are the policies that drive that management? Making sure that in all of those layers, we are integrating and rooting our work in environmental justice. And so that looks internally firstly. And so at National Wildlife Federation, I'm able to work across our teams who work in science and conservation science, as well as our policy team to find ways to integrate environmental justice and equity into these dimensions of our work. And also with our partners. And so I work pretty extensively with public agencies, so federal agencies, as well as state wildlife agencies, to think about how they integrate environmental justice and equity into the way that they engage their constituents who are paying for the function of our state agencies and federal agencies, to ensure that the resources that they are managing are being made available and benefiting all people, all of their the constituents in their states and across this continent. And so as I've approached this work and I've had the opportunity to dig into the beautiful diversity of birds that live across this continent, I've been able to do deep dives into understanding some of the intricacies of what threats birds are facing to their survival in a changing world, and have also had the opportunity to use birds as a way to connect people with, or I shouldn't even say connect. Sometimes, most people, we have a connection to the environment that exists in some way, but how can birds be a way to augment that or expand that or make that an even more beautiful and brilliant connection? I realized that birds really are a multiplier for environmental justice. I did not come up with that phrase. So at the end of 2022, the State of the Birds report was released for this year, and it's released every few years. And Tyke James, and who's a colleague of mine, and some others were talking about kind of environmental justice as it relates to bird conservation. And someone used the phrase multiplier for environmental justice, and I just love that. You may be familiar with the word multiplier when it comes to threats in particular. So when it comes to climate change, people oftentimes refer to climate change as a threat multiplier, which it is, right? So places that are kind of naturally dry, climate change will make drought even more intense. Places that experience storms, climate change will make storms more intense. So it is multiplying the threats that already exist. A multiplier for environmental justice is a different spin, a different take on this idea of a multiplier. And birds are the perfect example of something that can be a multiplier for environmental justice. And there are a couple of reasons why. First, birds are incredible connectors, especially migratory birds. So this is a screenshot from the Bird Migration Explorer, which I would encourage you to check out, birdmigrationexplorer.org. And it shows you can kind of look in at various levels of detail, but you can see how birds move across continents, across hemispheres during migration. And the interesting and cool thing about birds is that the same bird that you may see as it's stopping over on its journey from South America, where it was spending the winter, to somewhere in northern North America where it might breed, you might see it in a random city park where you live, or in a random backyard, right? That same bird that's able to utilize that random, small, maybe fragmented piece of green space in your city, it needs that space to fuel up, to make it to its breeding grounds. And it might breed in a really large, expansive, hundreds of acres forest, right? But just because it breeds in these really large, quote unquote, pristine or high value conservation areas, doesn't mean it doesn't need our small half-acre city parks. It needs both of those things. And so birds, because of the diversity of landscapes that they utilize and require, they're connecting places when it comes to, what value those places have to offer wildlife, birds in particular. And so I try to veer away from actually designating places as high value or low value conservation areas, because something is using it, which makes it high value. And these are snapshots from a couple of stories from the State of the Birds report, which I would encourage you to check out. But these are both examples of the fact that in different parts of the country, there were needs that communities had. So on the right-hand side, you had a community that was experiencing a lot of flooding because of changes in the topography, or essentially the land use around their neighborhood. On the right-hand side, you had communities in Houston, Texas, that were experiencing, urban heat island effect, where you have extreme, hotter areas simply because, again, of the composition of the landscape. A lot of blacktop, a lot of built environment versus trees and green space. On the left-hand side in California, this is Jose Puente. His community had been advocating for investment in new levees and creating floodplains that would essentially prevent their communities from getting flooded whenever storms would come through. And they could not, for a long time, get the resources invested from the government they needed. When they finally were able to get that money, in addition to seeing that flooding kind of controlled and having their resources protected from water damage and flooding in the future, they saw birds come back. Lazuli bunting, flycatchers, all kinds of birds that weren't there because of the way that the landscape had been degraded. When their need was addressed, the birds came back too. The birds were benefited too. Same thing in Houston. When the green spaces in these urban environments were invested in to prevent urban heat island effect, birds came back. Birds thrived in places where there was investment for the purpose of helping people. And so when you think about this from a really holistic perspective, investing in people helps birds. Investing in birds can help people when you're really intentional to think about who are not only the most vulnerable wildlife species, but who are the most vulnerable communities and places. And so as a result, birds are serving as an environmental justice multiplier. But in addition to, investing in people helping birds and investing in birds being able to help people, when we ignore and divest in communities, that can hurt birds, and that can actually hurt our science about birds. And so this is a screenshot from eBird. So birders around the country are very excited about watching birds. And so we have these participatory or citizen science platforms where anybody can download, the free eBird app, and you input the data. You see, if you see a bird, you just say, I saw a northern cardinal today at this time, and boop, it's part of this huge data set that ornithologists use to help us understand where birds are, the diversity of birds found in a place, where birds are moving, how their populations are doing. So this, a friend of mine, Deja Perkins, who is a PhD student at North Carolina State University, is studying participatory science data inequity. And her research from her master's degree found that there is a real strong correlation between socioeconomic status and where eBird data was found. And so I was like, I wonder if that's true for Atlanta, where I live. And sure enough, this is literally just a screenshot of eBird, right, of the city of Atlanta. You see a lot of data points kind of concentrated in the northeast area of Atlanta, and that is a really wealthy section, probably the wealthiest section of Atlanta. But there's not a whole lot of data points in the southwest section of Atlanta. And what this is showing you is not that there are more birds in Northeast Atlanta, which is what you would think it's showing you. It just says this is where people have actually input data about birds. But what I know, because I live in Southwest Atlanta, is that there are far more birds in Southwest Atlanta. I go birding here all the time. I also go birding in Northeast Atlanta. And there are hundreds of acres of old growth forest and green space in Southwest Atlanta, but because the communities in that area have not been engaged with by the entities that are using things like eBird and other participatory science platforms, that's really the pattern that you're seeing. But looking at this, you would assume that there are birds here in Northeast and not here in Southwest, which is dangerous, right? We don't want data holes that are telling us incorrect things about where birds are, because that impacts our science and the decisions that we make about bird conservation in the future. And so because birds are connectors utilizing habitats from rural to urban gradients, and when we invest in the needs of communities, we're also helping to invest in the needs of birds. And because injustice impacts the way that our science is done when it comes to birds, it is really important that we are thinking about birds and people in conservation, but it also is a demonstration that birds really do multiply benefits for communities, especially communities that are most exposed to environmental harm. And so kind of going into the end of this story arc that I'm telling you here, so in 2020,
oh God, I remember this horror story.
Yeah, as you probably heard. So Christian Cooper, who's pictured here, who's a dear friend and an incredible active, advocate for birds. He's also like a superstar animator. He's worked for Marvel. Like, he's just like the bomb, right? He birds in Central Park pretty frequently. He's on the board of New York City Audubon and has been for many years. He was birding in Central Park, and there was a woman who was letting her dog run off leash in this conservation area. So he asked her to put it on leash because it's a conservation area. And then she, called the police on him and falsely claimed that he was threatening her life, her and her dog's life. And he, smartly, obviously took out his phone and recorded the whole thing because she was lying and trying to weaponize the police against him. And when that story, he wasn't even going to share this with anyone. I think he shared it with his sister, who then put it online. Had she, the moment that video kind of hit the airwaves, the folks, the Black folks who had kind of over the, past couple of years gotten connected in the birding world, we were like, oh my gosh, like, did you see this? We have to do something. And it was actually a friend of mine, Anna, who was part of this network of Black people who love nature. And we were kind of in a group chat together, and she was like, we have to do something about this. And literally from the moment she made that comment, and over the next 48 hours, a group of us came up with the idea of what became the first inaugural Black Birders Week, and this was in 2020. And it was a group of about 30 people who worked together to put a whole itinerary of online engagement and questions and programs together, literally, again, in 48 hours. And it ended up being a life-changing experience for all of us. And the three main goals of this first Black Birders Week was, number one, to elevate the systemic problem that, a lot of folks, particularly, white folks or folks who hadn't experienced these kinds of discrimination, a lot of times our experiences were kind of painted as one-off, situations, like, oh, that was just John and he just acts like that, right? Like as if this is, treating our experiences as though they are in isolation, when in fact they're part of a whole network and systemic problem. So we wanted to draw attention to the fact that these are not one-off situations. This happens to so many of us so frequently. It is systemic in nature. Number two, we wanted to celebrate diversity, right? The fun thing about birding and enjoying birds is that it is the celebration of bird diversity. It is going out to see how many different kinds, how large of a diversity of birds you can find. And that is what makes it so beautiful and so fun. And then thirdly, we wanted to be able to create space for Black birders to feel community, to be liberated from the constraints that we had experienced before in other spaces, and to be able to kind of just be our whole selves with one another. Because the reality was that there were a lot of us, a lot of Black people who love birds, a lot of Black people who love nature. But unfortunately, in our physical environments, we were often the only people who were Black. And especially if we were young, we were probably also the only young people. And it wasn't until we started finding each other online, literally on Twitter and Instagram, that we were like, oh my gosh, there are more of us. When Black Birders Week happened, I never thought that there were so many. I couldn't have possibly known how many Black people there were who loved birds. And so over the course of that week, we decided to, every day of the week, have a different challenge or hashtag associated with that day. So we had things like Black in Nature, Post a Bird, Birding While Black, Black Women Who Bird, Ask a Black Birder. So these different opportunities for people anywhere in the world to kind of engage on similar topics every single day. And when I tell you thousands and thousands and thousands of Black people connected just that one week around birds, it changed my life, literally for the future, for the better. And we saw some incredible, just, I don't want to say testimonials, but just examples of what this did for other people. And for example, one of a teacher who I've now been connected with, her name is Miss Abdullah, she was saying for the first time, she was able to see another woman in hijabi, you know what I mean, going birding and connect with other Black people and show her students, Black people who love nature and birding. The National Wildlife Federation, who I did not work for at that time, but had kind of mentally noted their engagement with Black Birders Week, decided to make a whole fellowship program that paid college-age students and early career students or professionals for fellowships and provide more opportunities for Black and Brown interns to connect them with careers in the natural sciences, in particular in wildlife science. And we were able to somehow, this effort was elevated on everything from CNN to NPR to National Geographic, New Yorker, random, like we could not have possibly imagined that this effort, which was unfortunately stemmed from a traumatic experience on the part of a beloved member of our community, would birth such an incredible movement to make this space safer, more liberating, more peaceful, and inviting for Black people. Yeah, and so someone did the math, and in that 1 week, there were over 6 million engagements worldwide from Black Birders Week, and this was all such a surprise, but really kind of demonstrated what the power can be when you're able to have community. If we were all still isolated and never found each other, right? I don't think that Black Birders Week would have happened, but there's something so powerful about living and working and being able to respond to threats in the context of community that makes organizing so powerful. And so I'm so grateful for the community of people who made that happen. And Black Birders Week happens every year, and it usually starts on Memorial Day, that Memorial Day weekend, and goes to the first week of June. And so please do be on the lookout. I'm no longer a co-organizer. Other folks have kind of stepped up and taken on that mantle, but be on the lookout for Black Birders Week this week and participate when you see those hashtags going live. And so in conclusion, circling back to this idea of responding to threats in community being very important. So I'm not sure if you've heard of the word murmuration before. I know Texas, I can guarantee that Texas has some of the most incredible bird sites in the country, including murmurations. Murmurations are essentially when a large flock of birds, typically European starlings, they flock together in as many as, several dozen to hundreds to even thousands of birds. and they're flying in formation in what appears to be this huge glob in the sky, and it's beautiful. It's incredible to watch. Like, you're watching from a distance, and I tear up every time I see this. I'm like, this is the most incredible, phenomenon in nature that I've ever seen when it comes to birds. But what it actually is that they are coming together around a threat. So usually, if you see a murmuration, a big cloud of birds flying in formation, if you're able to look, just outside the edge of that cloud of birds, there's usually a bird predator, like a falcon or a hawk or some sort of predator that is threatening the group. And so those birds are flying in formation to avoid getting killed, to avoid any of the birds kind of getting picked off. And there is something to be learned from this. The way that these birds are able to function in such a large group with so much coordination, number one, is because not one bird is the leader. So depending on where the flock is moving, where the flock is, relative to their environment, different birds are essentially kind of dictating the direction and overall movement of the flock at different times. And so sometimes if a bird is the better leader at this moment, they're leading. If a different bird is a better leader for this moment, they're leading, right? So there's never just one leader the entire time. So you have to be willing to both lead and be led when that time is appropriate. And the second piece is being responsive and paying attention to your neighbor. Murmurations are able to function because every single bird is paying closest attention to, with surgical precision, attention to the birds most surrounding it. I believe it's the 7 most closely oriented birds to themselves, to make sure that they are flying essentially in lockstep with those individuals. And that kind of coordination, when each bird is paying attention to the birds around them, spreads throughout the whole flock. And now this flock is moving with so much coordination. And this analogy came from a friend of mine, Billy Allman, who is a bomb.com biomimicry expert, an engineer. And nature has so much to teach us about solving problems. And we usually think about it in the context of like technology or innovations in healthcare, for example, but it's also true for our social systems and how we interact with each other. And so I just want to encourage you, as you are pursuing problem solving in whatever space that you work in, doing so in community is of the utmost importance, and how leadership happens and your ability to pay attention to your neighbors and their needs is critical. And so with that, I will end and take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Corina. That was wonderful. I love all the images that you shared, and the storytelling was really refreshing and exciting. So thank you for sharing your story with us. And I'm just looking in the chat, and you answered our question about Black Birders Week dates. So it sounds like it's coming up. And I think that, yeah, Sarah, well, did we put a hashtag from Instagram? You can find the Black Birders Week information on Instagram, and I believe there's a website and lots of social media around
Yes.
Black Birders Week.
And I'll also say that the organization that, or the kind of community of people that are organizing this, the group is called Black AF in STEM, and they have a website. And I can actually go ahead and grab the link to that website so that you can just have it in your back pocket for when Black Birders Week starts, and you can kind of keep track of what's happening.
Awesome, thank you. So there's definitely a lot of chatting going on. Yes, folks, please put your questions for Corina in the chat. Lots of kudos. There were some interesting comments just around eBird when you were talking about that. So I'll just read a couple. I love how birding helps to heal generational trauma, often trauma inflicted on communities without consent, connecting with the land despite how Western colonial society restricts us or tells us to. I forgot to say the name. That was Rachel Caldwell Hill. And then we had a comment from Ann Terry, Tracy Aviary. I've encountered the same regarding eBird in the west side of Salt Lake City. I encouraged my neighbors early in the pandemic to try eBird as I noticed a hole in the data and ended up being invited to write an article for our West Side community newspaper.
That's awesome.
Yeah, let's see if there's some questions on here. Someone says, oh, they're coming in quick. Someone said they loved your ologies. She heard you on ologies, Amanda Van Dusen. She loved your ologies
Thank
podcast.
you. Thank you.
Jennifer Bowley's reminding us to check out the Merlin Bird ID app as well.
Yes.
Merlin, MERLIN. And then, Corina, you were talking about the global migration tracker. I wanted to put a message in there about that. What's the official that?
Okay, I can put the link to that website. It's a new, they actually just recently launched it. It's a very cool tool. Bird Migration Explorer. It's by Audubon. So copying it now, and I'll throw it in the chat. Feel free to use it and share it.
Thank you. I have a question here from Talit S. Very much enjoyed your story. I would imagine the mentoring work that you must be called to do for the upcoming generation is quite extensive. Can you please speak on how much energy you put into that and how this balances with your paid work? Great question. Thank you.
Yeah, that is a good question. Thank you for asking. So I would say that thankfully, because I've come to be connected with this really large network of other Black people who are wildlife scientists or, you know, various other kinds of professionals in this general space of natural sciences. So there are times when I just, you know, may not have the capacity to meet with or even talk to certain groups or certain individuals, just depending on my own personal schedule. But I have a whole bunch of friends. And so like we pass things to each other. So I don't ever take anything on by myself because I know it's not possible. There are thankfully more folks coming up now than there were in our generation who are really kind of digging into pursuing this work. And so if for some reason I don't have the capacity or I don't have the expertise they're looking for, I am reaching out to the network of folks that I've been able to find online, whether they're close friends or kind of distant associates, and I pass their information along and make connections to people who can help them. And so, and I also recognize that, and sometimes the mentorship isn't, you know, like kind of ongoing or regular meetings. I don't think I really have many people quite like that, where it's I'm meeting them, you know, meeting with them maybe monthly or something, but even one conversation can be so powerful. And so a lot of people reach out and they just have some questions they want to ask me, like 15 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour or something. And it's like parents and their kids, right? And just providing a glimpse into the work that I'm doing and what I've learned over the course of that time turns out to be invaluable. And it was invaluable for me too. Like just getting that one exposure to that one zookeeper who sat me down and told me a whole bunch about zookeeping and conservation. It set my trajectory on a different path. And so it ranges from kind of more in-depth kind of relationships all the way up to, you know, and kind of long-term relationships to, you know, very brief conversations just to help answer people's questions. And if I can't do one or both of those things, I pass them on to other people.
Thank you so much. That's really powerful. And I'm sure the folks that you're interacting with and all the youth are super excited to be communicating with you and learning from you. So that's wonderful. We have another question here from Trudy Smith with the Buffalo Bayou Partnership. She says, I'm here in Houston. What is a good way to encourage engagement from Black birders, promoting birding to a diverse group?
So I believe it's always important that communities, I would say the most effective way to kind of engage any community in any particular activity or any particular activity, birding or otherwise, is to really kind of connect with the leaders of that community first and ensure that they, first of all, have the buy-in or the trust built, and then working from there. Because entering a community, I don't know if you are a Black person or if you're a Black person in Texas or what your context is that you're coming from. But it's important that trust and relationship building are the foundation of whatever, you know, future exploit you would like to have with a community. I shouldn't say exploit, work that you would like to do with a community, and then empowering the people in those communities to lead. And there are several actual programs that I've seen in Georgia and other places where people train teachers in schools or educators or just community leaders to lead bird walks, or how to integrate birds into how they teach. Even pastors I've seen, like working with pastors to talk about natural science and things like that and birds, and how to kind of just integrate birds into what they're doing, so that the community is hearing from their own people and hearing from their own leaders. And so that's always my recommendation: connect to the people who are trusted by the community, and whatever resources you can provide that they can then use to connect the community to the subject matter, like birding, is the best way to go. Or at the very least, you're building trust with the community leaders so that you can come in and lead the bird walks or lead the education programs, whatever makes sense and it works best for the community. But they should have the opportunity to kind of identify what that is.
Thank you. That's excellent advice. We have another question from Grant Ellis. Are you able to speak to the economic impact birds and birding can have on communities? And in particular, if you have any data to share on the impact to communities of color or minority populations. Great presentation, by the way.
Thank you. I do not have data to share on kind of economic impacts of like birding, but I will say that birding as a form or a vehicle for ecotourism, for example, is very powerful. And one of my favorite Black-led ecotour organizations or companies is based out of Alabama in the Black Belt, the Joe Farm. And it actually, they have like a Black Angus beef farm and a whole bunch of land. And they, one day noticed that people kept stopping by the outside of their fields looking at something. And so one day they're like, what are you looking at? Right? They're like peering onto their property, and they were like swallowtail kites and Mississippi kites eating all these bugs every time they would go to cut the grass. And they were able to turn that into a whole kind of ecotourism opportunity for people on their land, right? And like has created a really incredible economic opportunity for them and opportunity for people in their community and beyond to connect with their work. And so I have my experience is more kind of case by case and individuals by individuals. Having knowledge about birds and the desire to educate others alone is such an incredible tool that can be used for economic development and economic sovereignty and security. And I've seen it happen. I don't know what that data is, but I am really excited for ecotour companies and those who have really started to dig into birding and leading groups on these kinds of adventures. It's been very encouraging to see how that not only provides joy and the satisfaction that comes from the act of birding, but being able to benefit economically from that work and to benefit from maintaining environments that do promote bird diversity and bird health too. So it's kind of a win-win for people and a win for birds. You're kind of incentivized to manage your land in a way that is good for birds.
Thank you. And that whole conversation just kind of reminded me of the birding tourism in the Rio Grande Valley here in Texas. I mean, it's a pretty huge tourism draw, and there's probably something to be learned from those communities in that part of Texas, kind of capitalizing on migration patterns and just the diversity of birds that are found there and migrate through that area. So
Awesome.
have folks that we can connect you to if that's of interest in learning more.
Thanks.
Our next message is from Rhonda Richardson. I love your messages. Can diverse people join Blackbirders? Diversity makes us strong.
Can you say that one more time, the last part?
Can diverse people join Blackbirders? Diversity makes us strong.
Yeah, so Blackbirders Week, anyone can participate, but we encourage everyone to participate. So let me start by saying that in Blackbirders Week, and it is a celebration of Blackbirders, and I think that's good. And so Blackbirders Week in particular is for the purpose of kind of uplifting Blackbirders specifically. And that is a way that we're kind of fostering diversity because, we haven't really felt a place in just birding groups, which have typically been all white and usually mostly older folks. And so we encourage everyone to participate. And we also, as a group and as people, also take the opportunity to uplift Indigenous folks who are in the birding space and other communities of color who are in the birding space. And we encourage each other to celebrate one another. But yeah, so I definitely encourage as many people as possible to participate in Blackbirders Week.
Thank you. We have a question from Mary Ann Ritchie. How have coastal wind farms affected bird populations and migration?
So not all wind farms, of course, are have equal impacts environmentally speaking. I don't necessarily have data on particular population impacts for any given species. There are certain species that are more vulnerable to turbines placed in certain places. And so right now, and kind of moving forward, as siting is happening for where turbines are placed, because there will be a huge ramp up of, renewable energy like wind energy, and wind farms placed kind of off the coast and way out kind of into the water. And so a lot of the work that's being done now is understanding, okay, what have been the impacts and how do we mitigate the possible harms of placing wind farms in migratory paths, right? And so if you for wind farms off the coast, a lot of your coastal birds, obviously like terns, birds that nest on the coast as well, in addition to migrating along the coast, are of great concern. And so most of my knowledge and understanding is kind of around like, what does it look like looking into the future, and who are we engaging as far as federal agencies, communities, scientists, and making sure that our renewable energy is as least harmful as possible for wildlife and birds. But they can, if unchecked and uninformed by science, can absolutely cause quite a bit of harm to bird populations. And so a lot of work is happening to ensure that that does not happen as wind farms production or construction accelerates.
So we have a lot of wind farms in Texas. So when I giant wind farms, I always think about the birds, and
gotcha.
Yeah, it's a challenging balance there.
Yeah, there will never be no impact. I can say that much.
Yes, that is true. Yeah. Thank you. Another question from Brisaida Yanes. What tips would you give someone who wants to work in a similar field as you, as a person of color working in conservation? I'm currently trying to find work after graduating with my master's, and it has been very difficult.
I would definitely say, thank you for that question. And I would definitely say that networking and having connections and mentors is really important. And not mentors necessarily, again, in any sort of formal sense per se, but people who are doing or have done the work that you would like to do, having the opportunities to connect with them and get advice from them about the process of whether it's finding a job, or it's, once you're in a job, how to do the job well, or whatever that context might be. And also, a lot of, just again, from my informal friend networks that have kind of built over time, when opportunities or positions become available, like we'll throw it in the chat, or share, when postings are made available or public. And then, you can also, over time, as you build a network, have people who can help you, when it comes to recommendations and the actual process of getting the job. So my biggest recommendation is always surround yourself with people who can support you or who have done what you want to do, so that they can kind of help guide your next steps as you come across them.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. We have just a couple of minutes left. Anybody else have some questions for Corina? Let's see. Oh, here's one from Sarah. Where are you located? We have a job board on our webpage. Oh, wait. That might not be for you, Corina. We have a job board on our webpage for Texas that may be helpful as well. I think it was for the person that just asked that question that you answered.
Awesome.
Let's see. Yes. Brisaida says, thank you. Yes, that was very helpful. I'm just putting some information in the chat. I put our evaluation for today's webinar to provide feedback to Texas Children in Nature Network about our offerings, and also to Corina as a presenter. She did great. And I also put some information about our upcoming webinar, another webinar, May 3rd, on mindfulness in nature with Starla Simmons from the University of Texas at Austin, and the registration link is there. I encourage you all to register for that. And let's see if there's another. Lots of thank yous to Corina. I feel like I have one more thing. Oh yes, I have a couple little. Other things I'm going to put in about becoming a partner if you aren't already a partner with the Texas Children in Nature Network. And then we love, love, love donations. So I'm going to put that in there as well. When you donate to our organization, it helps us bring these wonderful speakers for webinars, helps us provide resources to our partners. Let's put on the annual summit, which is coming up in Houston, December 6th through the 8th. We encourage you all to attend. Registration will be opening up in August, and we'll be sending information through our social media and newsletters and that sort of thing about the details and all of that good stuff about the summit and what we're going to be doing and who our keynote speakers are and all of that. Oh, somebody, I like that. What is your favorite bird? Of course, a blue jay, right? How you got your start. All righty. Well, we're right at 3 o'clock. So just want to thank everybody for participating and being so engaged, and to Corina for her time and her storytelling and sharing all this wonderful information and also inspiring us all. So I encourage everyone to go out and bird, do a little birding this weekend, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much. Thanks again, Corina. Take care. Bye.